This is the Sermon Podcast from First Christian Church of Kokomo, Indiana for November 6th, 2016. Our community of faith gathers each Sunday morning at 9:30 a.m. for worship, and you will find us scattered throughout our community all week long, seeking to live out the way of Jesus. We hope that you will find these words encouraging and meaningful. This week, Pastor William Jewsbury gives his thoughts on No Longer Strangers.
We're in the Gospel of Matthew today, but as we read the story that is appointed in Matthew 15, we know that there is behind that a long and difficult history that sets the stage for this remarkable series of events. The first event is Jesus talking to a mother. The second is a scene of healing of a group of people. The third is the feeding of another group of people, just like the feeding of the 5,000 just a few days earlier, but now 4,000, and in a very different place. Hear the Gospel of Matthew for today. From there, Jesus went to the regions of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from those territories came out and shouted, "Show me mercy, Son of David. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." But he didn't respond to her at all. His disciples came and urged him, "Send her away. She keeps shouting out after us." Jesus replied, "I've been sent only to the lost sheep, the people of Israel." But she knelt before him and said, "Lord, help me." He replied, "It is not good to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off their masters' tables." Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. It will be just as you wish." And right then her daughter was healed. Jesus moved on from there along the shore of the Galilee Sea. He went up a mountain and sat down. Large crowds came to him, including those who were paralyzed and blind and injured, unable to speak, and many others. They laid him at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd was amazed when they saw those who had been unable to speak talking, and the paralyzed cured, and the injured walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Now Jesus called his disciples and said, "I feel sorry for this crowd because they've been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry for fear they won't have enough strength to travel." His disciples replied, "Where are we going to get enough food in this wilderness to satisfy such a big crowd?" Jesus said, "How much bread do you have?" They responded, 7 loaves and a few fish. He told the crowd to sit on the ground. He took the 7 loaves of bread and the fish. After he gave thanks, he broke them into pieces and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate until they were full. The disciples collected 7 baskets full of leftovers. 4,000 men ate, plus women and children. After dismissing the crowds, Jesus got into the boat and came to the region of Magadan. This needs to be unpacked. So first, let's start with some geography. I'm going to have Dave put a map up on the screen. This is the map of Israel at the time of Jesus. I know it's a little far away from you, but I've got a laser pointer. Maybe I can get it aimed here. There it is. So Jesus, we find out, is in Nazareth, which is right there. If you see the dance, try to do that. He's been in Nazareth, in his hometown. And we read that he hears the news that John the Baptizer has been killed by Herod. And so he gets in a boat to escape the crowds. Now, if you look back up there again, you'll see there's Nazareth. There's the Sea of Galilee. That's 15 miles across there. So apparently at some point he and his disciples have gravitated towards the Sea of Galilee. And so he goes to the Sea of Galilee, he gets in a boat, and apparently he goes down the coast a little ways. Maybe up, we don't know, but probably hugging the coast. That's what they tended to do in those small fishing boats. down the coast just a little bit. But then we read that the crowds find him anyway, and he has compassion for them and offers healing. And we have the wonderful story of the feeding of the 5,000 there in the heart of Galilee. All of this is Galilee here. This whole area is the Galilee. And he feeds them and sends them on their way. And then we have the story of Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee, which is probably across this lower tip, ending up in Gennesaret. And of course, we know there's various stories about Gennesaret. And then in today's text, we find that he leaves there, Gennesaret, and goes up to Tyre, which is up there in the Syro-Phoenician area, right about where the map ends at the north, about 40 miles from Nazareth. That's the geography. He's not really all that far from home, but he's crossed over into a foreign territory. He's in Syro-Phoenicia now. He's in another land with different people. So that's the geography. That's enough of the map. Thank you, Dave. Then we read this. A Canaanite woman from those territories came out and shouted. A Canaanite woman. Now, if you read your Bible very much, and it's hard to keep track of those thousands of pages, but if you read very much, you might recognize that word Canaanite hasn't been heard for a while. When Mark tells us this story in his gospel, we're in Matthew now, but when Mark tells the same story, he calls the woman a Syro-Phoenician woman. He puts her in the location she's in. She's in Syro-Phoenicia, up there around Tyre and Sidon. That's accurate. That's a good way to describe her. But Matthew uses the term Canaanite. We haven't heard Canaanite for a long time. The Canaanites were those tribes who occupied the land where the Hebrew people were headed when they left their Exodus journey. The Canaanites represented both a political and religious foe. They occupied the land, and the Israelites needed to move into that land. They were told by God, take that land, drive the Canaanites out. But they were also a religious foe because all through the middle of the Old Testament, most of the times when the Israelites get in trouble with God, it's because they've adopted Canaanite religion. They worship the Baal gods. They've done different sacrifices. They've worshiped in different places. And so that combination of a religious temptation and a political foe was intense. But the Canaanites are long gone. Over the years, that nation, that tribe of people has been conquered and has intermarried and has been assumed into other cultures. Brian McLaren comments in his book, calling this woman a Canaanite would be like calling someone a Viking or an Aztec today. That's how far back that Canaanite line came from. Lots of things to call her, but Canaanite would have been one of the last ones. But Matthew calls her a Canaanite. There's something going on here. Matthew wants us to pay attention to what's going on. So this woman, she came out and shouted, "Show me mercy, Son of David. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." But Jesus didn't respond to her at all. Think about that. Jesus didn't even acknowledge her presence. Quite a difference. Actually, Deb did a wonderful job of setting this up. I didn't realize that's what she was doing. That's maybe the one time Jesus really put up a keep out sign. Leave me alone. I don't even want to talk to you. And his disciples came and urged him, send her away. She keeps shouting after us. They know this is the wrong place at the wrong time. Just a few days ago, the Pharisees and scribes were yelling at Jesus about all sorts of things he was doing. Can you imagine, the disciples think, what they'd think now? Here we are up near Tyre and Sidon in a foreign country, and Jesus is being approached by a Canaanite woman. And Jesus seems to agree with them. He replied, I've only been sent to the lost sheep, the people of Israel. This is a very difficult, awkward moment. But she knelt before him, and said, "Lord, help me." And he replied, "It's not good to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." And she replied, "But even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And he says back to her, "You have such great faith. It will be just as you wish." And right then her daughter was healed. Now, I've read lots of different ways to try to unpack this story. You probably have too. William Barclay kind of set the stage about 75 years ago in his daily study Bible. He said that when Jesus uses that word dog, it's really more like puppy. It's a diminutive of the Greek. And so he was just playing with her, is what Barclay says. That he was just saying, "Oh, we shouldn't give this kind of good stuff to the puppies." It was a sweet moment, and maybe so, almost a term of endearment, inviting her into more conversation. And I've even preached on that before. I kind of grimace a bit that I've done that, because he called her a dog. He said, "You're not even human to me. You're nobody. You're not even worthy to be heard." And that becomes especially pointed because in this story, Matthew says to us, she's a Canaanite. She's the lowest of the low. She's the worst of the worst. She is our mortal enemy, the one that we have feared for nearly 1,000 years. In Deuteronomy, if you've been reading along in We Make the Road by Walking, we have a very troubling story about these hated people. Moses is talking to the people of Israel as they gather on the shore of the River Jordan, saying, "Here's what you have to do when you cross over into this Canaan land." He says, "Now once the Lord your God brings you into the land, you're to enter and take possession of it. And you're to drive out the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, these 7 nations that are larger and stronger than you. And once the Lord your God lays them before you, you must strike them down, placing them under the ban." And the ban was a word that is used in Hebrew and in Greek that means total destruction. Everything is destroyed. It's holy war. They go in and kill the people, the children, the livestock. In some cases, they would even salt the fields so they could never again be used. Total destruction. And he goes on, don't make any covenants with them, don't be merciful to them, don't intermarry with them, don't give your daughter to one of their sons to marry, don't take one of their daughters to marry your son, and so forth. And as the story unfolds, we hear more commands to go into the land and to kill every man, woman, child, cattle, sheep, strip the fields of their harvest. Complete destruction. And again, if you're watching your Bible, this is only 3 chapters after God gave them the 10 Commandments saying, "Thou shalt not kill." But that's the level of hatred, of enmity that has been a part of the interaction of Jews and those Canaanites for so many centuries. But here's Jesus talking to a Canaanite woman, and he's struggling with the conversation. He doesn't want to do this. First, he won't respond, then he calls her a dog, and then finally he relents and offers her daughter healing. But not only that, I think he offers healing for an ancient hatred that has plagued his people over all those centuries. Because the next story then is that they gather with a huge crowd down just a little closer to the Sea of Galilee, and he offers healing to many. And we might think, oh, he's back in familiar territory, but there's a little key word in there that makes such a difference on this. He's gathering with these people and offering them healing, and Matthew reports, and they praised the God of Israel. Now, if they were Hebrews, if they were Jews, Matthew would have no need to identify which God. It would be automatic. They praised God. But instead, Matthew says they praised the God of Israel. These are foreigners. These are still Gentiles, maybe Canaanite, maybe people who are Syrophoenician. And then he goes on and they feed these 4,000. There in the friendly confines of the hillsides north of the Sea of Galilee, these 4,000 gathers, and I think Matthew again is trying to get our attention because after they're fed, there's 7 baskets left over. Not 12 like the 5,000, but 7. And scholars throughout the ages have said probably that represents those 7 tribes that were driven out in Deuteronomy. It represents those 7 that were killed, driven out, marginalized, although ended up being they weren't that far away. So what does this say to us today? I have wrestled with this all week long. I really wanted to try to speak on that issue of violence, particularly violence that is ordained by God when God says to somebody, go out and kill everybody else, because it's so foreign. Stories like that have bothered me since high school. The old high school Bible studies, we try to make sense because they do not reflect the God that I see in Jesus Christ. They do not reflect the God that I seek to follow. And I kind of got a glimmering late in the week as I read the story over and over again and listened to that interaction between Jesus and this Canaanite woman. This woman who was begging for mercy for her daughter. And Jesus rejects her and then calls her a dog and finally relents. And I think Jesus is wrestling as well. He knows the violent, divided history of his people. He knows how many times they had invoked God's name to be violent, to oppress others. He had just recently been in Jerusalem when people were ready to stone a woman caught in adultery, and he said, no, he said, unless you can prove that you don't have sin, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. He was fighting against this impulse to violence, and he had every right as the Son of God to come in and condemn that violence, to announce judgment, to condemn those ancient and deep-seated prejudices as contrary to God's will. But I think he knew something else, that words weren't enough. Oh, he used words. He talked to us about, love your neighbor and turn the other cheek and love your enemy and things like that. He used words, but I think in this instance, he recognized that words were not enough. So there he is with his disciples across the border, both geographically and religiously. He has taken them to a place and a people whom they had been taught to hate and to fear. And he reflects their own discomfort as he wrestles with his feelings for this woman. He wants to reject her like everyone else has, but something is moving him because he knows that those ancient images of violence and separation must be dealt with. And so he heals. And then he moves on and heals an entire crowd of people and then feeds thousands of foreign, hated Gentiles with the breaking of bread, the gift of God's grace. I learned as a child that old saying that we all know, actions speak louder than words. We all try to live by that. We try to be good people. And I think here we read of Jesus changing the entire narrative of history by his action, by showing his disciples in that moment that healing will be extended even to the most hated of the enemy, that the blessing of the gift of food, breaking bread with one another, will be extended even to those who have been apart for so long. It is a lesson about how Jesus would have us act in the face of violence, of injustice, or even hatred. So what about us today? I've been following the story of the Native Americans protesting the pipeline at Standing Rock, the North Dakota Access Pipeline. And you may have noticed, if you follow that very much, that towards the end of this week, 350 clergy from all around the country came and joined them on the protest lines, including a number of disciple pastors from here in Indiana. And I recognize there are no simple answers to this. This is not one of those things where it's real clear-cut. But what happens when ancient stories of division and conquest come face to face with realities of modern energy and commerce? Whatever the legitimacy of that protest, and we can argue about that all day long, the fact that people were moved to go and stand with them in their time of need says a lot. And I thought about our ongoing national dilemma with immigration that is so politicized, and yet, like that Canaanite woman, when we actually are face to face with someone, maybe it changes how we respond to them. And I thought about the legacy of poverty that continues to divide our nation. You know, poverty has scarcely been mentioned in the debates of this political season. I think the argument's been largely among those who have a fair amount and those who have a whole lot. But those who have very little have been kind of left out. And maybe we need to be aware that we also are called to feed the 5,000, the 4,000, the strangers among us. So what does it say? I think it says that talk alone isn't going to resolve very much. Jesus talked to us about loving the enemy and loving the neighbor, going the second mile. But then he also stopped and acted. That even in the uneasiness of that moment with that Canaanite woman who was so very different, he was moved to offer healing. That even when we're afraid of the other, carrying deep within our memories the anger of years of division, we can still act. We can offer healing to one who has wronged us. We can welcome the stranger. Jesus goes to a foreign land just 40 miles from home. And I'm willing to guess that his disciples had never been there. It's a place you didn't go. And there he meets a woman who looks like him. And he wrestles with his own feelings, not quite ready to give up that deep-seated hostility. But then he acts. He offers healing. First to one, and then to many. No longer strangers. Jesus shows us what his words are all about. Amen.